welcome one and all to the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind.
Yeah!
Very good. Oh, yeah. Well, how did that? That was fabulous. So tonight you'll notice we have a drastic change of venue. We've left our beloved Parliament Hall. I know. I'll resign later, I promise. So we're here this evening, but thank you very much for making the journey 3 streets over to come and join us. The motion that stands before the House this evening is that this House supports the rise of anti-establishment sentiment, which is a very interesting motion, and I'm very excited to welcome some wonderful speakers. So on the proposition, we have Dr. Foster and Hazel McArthur. I did that the wrong way around, didn't I? I did that the wrong way around. Okay, on the opposition, on the proposition, I've never done that, because we're in a different place. I've got Barry Will and Dr. Tsokov as well. So before we begin tonight's debate, I would like to invite the stand-in clerk of the House, which is actually the steward of the House, this is all going wrong this evening, Ariel, to read last week's minutes in the style of a champagne socialist. Wonderful.
Thank you all for coming to my soiree. I believe that any institution from 1794 onwards needs to come down immediately.
Point. Aren't you the steward of the Debating Society?
Counterpoint, every student in the Debating Society would want to see it come down.
There seems to be some disagreement in the House, so we shall have to take a vote by oral acclamation. All those in favour of taking the minutes as read, say aye.
Aye.
All those against, nay?
Nay.
It seems rather close. I shall have to consult with my sergeant.
Aye.
Aye? The minutes are taken as read.
Resign.
Really soon, I promise. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Foster to begin tonight's debate. Hear, hear! Okay, without further ado, we'll do this again. Without further ado, I would like to invite, is it Dr. Tsokov? Wonderful, to begin tonight's debate. Hear, hear!
Welcome everyone. So first I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to take part in this debate. I hope you can all hear me well. Yeah. Obviously the proposition that we're discussing today is a very timely question, considering the rise of the current rise of far right and what we might call radical conservative anti-establishment politics. However, I would like to put forward an argument that this is also a timeless issue, right? It's not necessarily something which is just in our time today, right? So I'll make this by 3 points. Obviously, I'm not very experienced in these debates, so I'm educated in political theory, so I'm going to try to make some theoretical arguments about timeless questions as democracy, populism, and anti-establishment. And then to demonstrate with academic practice, I'm going to try and reference and ground my definitions of these issues in the work of I would say, one of the most influential contemporary post-Marxist, Ernesto Laclau. Some of you might be familiar with his work. But Ernesto Laclau proposes a particular understanding of democracy, which has a peculiar relationship with his work on populism, right? So I'm going to go into some dry theory here, but I promise I will connect everything together towards that. So first, we need to understand that for Laclau, he sees democracy as this mode of government as essentially lacking, right? So there's no perfect harmonious society ruled by democracy. Democracy is never going to be just or represent equality or be able to represent everyone's opinion, right? What the essence of democracy is. Second, we need to understand that for Laclau, politics in general, democracy and politics, is antagonistic, right? So for him, democracy and politics are an arena where contesting political ideas and political ideologies and political parties are always competing for some sort of representation, right? A space where they can represent their thoughts and their ideologies. So here we can have, again, socialist ideologies, we can have liberal ideologies, we can have neoliberal ideologies, and we can have conservative ideologies, right? So for him, this is a constant battle of ideas. And thirdly, it's his idea of hegemony, which he borrows from Antonio Gramsci. And essentially, hegemony means that when we talk about hegemony is essentially the idea that there, at a certain time period, there's always some ideas which become more kind of dominant and structure our social relationships and understandings of politics in a better way. So why I'm going over this, now, I mean, with these three elements in mind, now we can approach McLeod's view on populism, which essentially is that populism is a discursive practice, right? So we have democracy, it's lacking, and each of these competing political ideas and parties fight, in a way that I'm going to simplify it, for hegemonic representation of their ideas. And what populists do, essentially, is construct particular discourses and identities through those discourses, which allow them to win that hegemony and kind of promote their ideas with the hopes that with their ideas, democracy will become complete. Yeah. So, in other words, for McLeod, populists often kind of produce this idea of the people who they try to capture with different ideas, ideological ideas, and those are always in opposition to some enemy, right? Because democracy is antagonistic, and this enemy could be, in our case, the establishment, right? So we're engaging in anti-establishment politics. This enemy could be, let's say, immigration. This enemy could be the liberal elite, right? So it's all a discursive practice that they use in order to win this hegemonic battle. Obviously, I'm butchering it here a bit. My point here is that populism and anti-establishment politics, at least in McLeod's view, are not necessarily a dirty word, as let's say other research in populism argues. It is, in fact, a type of political action, right? So for him, we can only engage in political action if we employ populist tactics. And if we take this view of populism, we can then apply it to perhaps some of the most influential, or perhaps some of the movements like workers' rights movements, women's rights movements, in which again particular ideologies of, let's say, the workers, through discursive procedures are opposed against an enemy, let's say the bourgeoisie, in order to achieve some type of hegemonic change in the world. In other words, populism, and we're going to use that for the final part of my speech, is, again, not necessary, but sorry. So this brings me to my third point, and this is my point in relation to the current kind of rise of anti-establishment politics, which is usually amongst what some academics call radical conservatives, or far-right politics, which are across Europe and the United States, obviously, get a lot of traction. Already ruling in Hungary, in the United States, and I'm not under no illusion that these types of politics will lead to something which is more democratic. In fact, we can see that key pillars of liberal democracies are under threat today. That could be the separation of power, exemplified through the amount of executive orders that Trump signs, or in the case of Hungary, that would be the convention state exception that they find themselves since 2018. So I mean, issues like pluralism or separation of power, which are key for our understanding of liberal democracy, are definitely under threat. However, I would also like to argue that this does not mean that we should not support anti-establishment politics, because again, based, if we agree with McLeod's view, which I try to propose, if we follow this logic, our only option is to engage in, for those of us who do not agree with these types of politics, and I'm sure some of you here might, statistically. So for those of us who do not agree with that, perhaps it's time for us to rethink the strategies that we take when we engage with politics, and perhaps engage in populism ourselves in order to try to rid ourselves of this predicament. So, sorry,
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. So, what is hopeful, perhaps, is one of the most, I would say, important realization in philosophy of the previous century is that history or historical development is contingent, which means that we can never know what our ideas, what our acts, what our promises will lead to, right? We can never have a certain idea of the future that we can act towards. And this is perhaps hopeful because in certain models of democracy that Borislav proposes, we always have the opportunity and the possibility to try and through particular strategies and employing anti-establishment politics, try to win that hegemonic position from which we can introduce different changes. And here, it's going to be a bit cheesy, but I wanted to finish with a quote from, I'm sure you've heard the quote, from Samuel Beckett, the Irish poet, who in kind of his concluding paper, Pages of Joyce, argues this thing about trying and failing in terms of, we can apply that to political projects. So it's ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. And I think it's only through anti-establishment politics that we can try to move away from this predicament. And I think that's
Just about it. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tsokov. I would now like to invite Dr. Foster to continue the debate. Here.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me here, and thank you everyone for turning up. And I apologise for the fact that I'm dressed in the most pro-establishment way possible. I used to be a furniture salesman, and I never get to wear my ties from my old days as a salesman. So, I wish to start by saying that I am not opposed to anti-establishment sentiment per se. Far from it. My research looks into Euroscepticism and national identities in Europe today. And an argument that I repeatedly frustrate my students with is that Euroscepticism is necessary for a functioning society. And a degree of establishment I'm quite nervous. A degree of establishment skepticism is essential to creating a functioning and healthy society. People who are unable to express their feelings against the status quo, if they are not given a vent, then it will boil to simmering point, at which point it is no longer manageable. John F. Kennedy did famously quip that people who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. At best, anti-establishment sentiment exposes deficiencies in the system. This drives reform, this drives change, which can greatly benefit the system. At worst, anti-establishment, we might think, just gives people a safety valve, a chance to rant with your mates down the pub, and then just go on earning money, paying your taxes, and the system keeps ticking over. This is the perceived strength of anti-establishment sentiment, but we are not living in a functioning society anymore. This is where I'm going to be very doom and gloom. I have a genuine belief that we are living in a global civilization which is characterized by apathy, anxiety, and anger, so prevalent that anti-establishment sentiment is no longer acting as a release valve for a healthy society. It's actively bringing in people who are not going to fix the system. They're going to make it much worse for you. People who don't want to challenge the establishment, they want to become the establishment and concentrate far more power into corrupt, incompetent, and malevolent hands than you would find in any bumbling old Etonian Prime Minister or dull, plodding son of a toolmaker in Westminster. Now, you've probably seen in recent years that study from MIT and the University of Melbourne from the 1970s, I believe, predicting that we're heading for a planet-wide civilizational collapse in the 2040s. History has no shortage of prophets of doom, the sort of people who in decades past would be parodied in cartoons as standing on a street corner wearing a sandwich board that says, "Repent, for the end is nigh." These people have always been wrong, but maybe Melbourne and MIT's study is not so wrong as we might think, because look around you and it's getting harder and harder to deny that our society is going through a major and very unpleasant shift. 2 weeks ago, we saw a study that 52% of Gen Z, I'll use the American phrase, in this country would prefer to be ruled by a dictator than a democratically elected government. Is that a benefit of anti-establishment sentiment? In the United States, an alcoholic weekend newsreader has become Secretary of Defense and is abandoning our Ukrainian allies to a genocidal regime. And barely 2 hours ago, a vaccine skeptic sociopath who bragged about dumping the carcass of a bear in Central Park became Secretary of Health, and now the richest person on earth, probably the richest person who has ever lived relative to other human beings at their time, is at this moment launching a naked coup d'etat in the White House in order to acquire even more money and hoard it, not to be redistributed to us, but hoard it all for himself, while hundreds of millions of people slide towards default and foreclosure. This is what anti-establishment sentiment has wrought. Now, last month, my colleagues at KCL published a major report that you can find online, arguing that the United Kingdom is set for societal collapse within the next 10 years. Not because of a foreign military attack or an ecological breakdown or some superbug resistant to our medicines, all of which could still be possible, if not likely, but because our society in Britain is becoming unsustainably unequal and is leading to the worst social tensions that we have seen since the 19th century. Now, this is the fault of the establishment. It's failed. 30 years of the post-Cold War consensus has left us high and dry. The rising tide did not lift all boats, and instead of joining hands and skipping merrily into Francis Fukuyama's fantasy of the 21st century, we are a crumbling civilization. So when Michael Gove famously said that the public have had enough of experts, I don't think he was wrong. But anti-establishment politicians are not the solution to our problems. Look at one example from across the pond where anti-establishment sentiment has spawned Mr. Musk's squad of fawning, fanatical teenage acolytes, so young that they probably haven't changed a razor blade as many times as they've now shut down a federally funded medical research program. Uncle Sam is an exemplar of what happens when rich lunatics and wealthy charlatans masquerading as anti-elites ride on a wave of anti-establishment sentiment. Now the society that cracked the atom and put a man on the moon now has a Secretary of Health who believes that drinking tap water turns you gay. Anti-establishment quackery has always existed. That's not new, but what is new is the perfect storm of two simultaneous developments in the 2020s. First is the internet. This has given national and global platforms to, frankly, lunatics. And second is a rising tide of anti-establishment at a time when people are so disillusioned by society and so disillusioned by the broken promises that we were made in the 20th century, that if you work hard, pay your taxes and obey the rules, you'll have a good life. This combination of broken promises and despair and an out-of-control internet, and yes, I do think it should be controlled a little bit, has made the system extremely dangerous. It is now an existential threat. Now, I'm old enough, just old enough, to remember the days when you would go into a pub and every type of pub had two types of people. One would be the pub bore who would tell rambling, go-nowhere stories to whoever happened to be sat next to him. The second type was the pub lunatic, who would regale unwilling listeners with incoherent insanity. Growing up in the northeast of England in the 1990s, the pub lunatic was usually a white supremacist who would start stories with something like, say what you will about Hitler, but he got this right. If you want a mental image, imagine Lawrence Fox chain-smoking hand-rolled cigarettes in a Darlington Wetherspoons, that sort of person. And when I moved down to London in 2016, the local pubs invariably had a different type of anti-establishment person, usually an aging, failed hippie, who would try to convince you that all cars can actually run on water, but the CIA keeps it covered up to protect big gasoline. I'm sure that these sort of people still exist. I just can't afford to go to pubs in London on an academic salary. But something has changed in the last 20 years. In the analogue age, the pub lunatic had a captive audience of whoever was willing to tolerate them for as long as it took them to pour your pint of Boddingtons. Today, with social media, the anti-establishment lunatic has an audience of the entire planet. And added to this is the increasing control of social media in the hands of a few obscenely wealthy people, wealthy men, who fall into two categories. Those whose delusions of grandeur and superhuman intellect have caused them to completely lose whatever grip on reality they had, to the extent that they now think they can get away with doing Nazi salutes at US presidential inaugurations. And second, anti-establishment figures who do not care and just want your money. Anti-establishment figures are not going to transform society through some radical restructuring. All they want to do is weaken the intricate, yet admittedly very badly broken system of democratic and institutional checks and balances on power, and hand over authority to unimaginably rich charlatans who have zero interest in you. All they care about is acquiring more and more of your money, and they don't care about bettering society. This is the toxic combination of public despair and the planetary town square of the internet, whereby malevolent people take anti-establishment feelings and channel it into projects that will not make things better, they will make them so much worse. I'm 40 and I can't afford a house. God help your generation, it's going to be so much worse. Do you really think that Nigel Farage and Elon Musk are going to lift one finger to help you out? This is what anti-establishment sentiment now brings. Not change, not improvement, only bailiffs and bank foreclosures. So this brings me on to my final point. Last semester I was teaching my undergrads on the module, The Theory and Practice of Empire. And a running theme in that module, which I've been teaching for bloody hell 10 years now, is the cliched question of why do empires collapse? And I imagine that you, like me, you're really fed up of the tsunami of blogs and YouTube essays and podcasts on the coming collapse of the American empire and whether we are living in the new 5th century. But one question that I do ask of my students on that module is why do empires rise? Maybe we are not living at the end of the Roman Empire. We are living at the end of the Roman Republic, a fundamentally broken and unequal system characterized by desperation and despair, waiting for a man to come along and promise you the world in exchange for ashes. Thank you.
Suitably depressed. I would now like to invite Barry Will to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
Thank you very much. It's quite nice to be back in St Andrews, and I can think of a few places quite as fitting to talk about the ruling class and the establishment this year. I did think about dressing up for this, but I did think that would be a bit too establishment of me. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. These are the words of Frederick Douglass, the anti-establishment slavery abolitionist. A lunatic, some might argue. If you lived in 1750, would you support the slave trade? If you lived in 1930s Germany, would you vote for the Nazis? If you lived during the Civil Rights era, would you support Jim Crow? And if you live in 2025, when you're watching the world burn, as our current establishment leads us down a path of genocide and suffering, famine and inequality, a state of complete collapse and the end of all life, would you support it? I met with a friend last night and told him I was doing this debate and what it was about. Anti-establishment, he said. In this economy, how could you be anything else? If you thought that Dr. Foster's speech was depressing, be prepared to lock in. By 2050, climate disasters will displace 1.2 billion people worldwide. The top 1% now hold 45% of global wealth, while 700 million people live in extreme poverty. Half of them are children, and that figure is increasing. Due to our complete inability to enact any meaningful change in regard to the climate, by 2040, not so far away, 5.4 billion people will face extreme water stress. In 25 years, half of the world's food production will be at risk. And meanwhile, right now, the top 10 agribusinesses, controlled by billionaires, generate $1.1 trillion annually, hoarding patents on drought-resistant seeds. By 2030, In 2023, 130 million people were forcibly displaced from their home due to war and violence, the highest number ever recorded, until 2024, of course, where it grew to 123 million. None of this is by mistake. The impacts I've described are not accidental. This is by design. The extraction of resources, warmongering, and the endless pursuit of economic growth at the cost of all human and non-human life is not the fault of the anti-establishment movement, as the opposition have argued. They are an integral part of our current neoliberal socio-economic world order. Everything the opposition has argued for tonight has been the product of this establishment. Our political order delivers genocide and laughs about it. It has done for decades. Our political order continues to increase inequality and imposes colonial empire with glee. Yet, although the establishment claim all these bad things are done in the name of the economy, none of us can actually afford rent. Housing is completely inaccessible, grocery prices are through the roof, and billions are denied essential healthcare. In this economy, how can you be anything but anti-establishment? When the establishment entrenches the wealth of a small elite, it has completely failed to meet the common people's basic socio-economic and environmental needs, I believe it's time to imagine a new politic. And I'm not alone. The egregious wealth inequality of society has left billions feeling empowered, disempowered, hopeless, and backed into a corner. This has directly fueled the rise of the far right and anti-establishment movement within it, with figures like Trump, Farage, and Le Pen rapidly gaining power. Figures who have just repackaged the status quo and offer no real alternative. Although anti-establishment politics doesn't inherently mean Proud Boy marches in Washington, DC. So what does a progressive anti-establishment movement look like today? Today, that looks like wealth redistribution on a scale so significant that every person of the world can afford to eat, house, and clothe themselves and their children. It looks like participatory democracy where common people participate directly in political decisions and policies that affect their lives. Where, when we reject genocide, we no longer commit it. It looks like joining a union and taking collective action, standing alongside your neighbours to change a system which has refused to change by itself. And what happens when we do that? Well, we win. I'm a community organiser for an anti-establishment union called Living Rent. And we have built power in our community in Edinburgh through the same practices and actions of all the anti-establishment figures before us. We're a mass membership organisation which actively rejects the status quo and works to find progressive alternatives. In the last 2 weeks, we just won £150 million of new council housing in Edinburgh. In the last few years, we changed the law so tenants across the country have more power than their landlord. And we're building lasting power in our members, where they have an active role in the decisions that govern them. And why is this especially important for the context of our debate tonight? Because all those people are disillusioned with the system and the establishment. They're fed up of being neglected by a political elite which favours landlords over their right to a safe and affordable home. Like the supporters of Trump, or even in extremes, the supporters of Adolf Hitler, they have lost trust in the social, political, and economic structures which govern our society, and they no longer believe in the ability of those structures to resolve many of the crises they're victim to. None of these people are lunatics, and it would be offensive to suggest so. History's lesson is brutal, but it's clear. Hopelessness is a weapon of mass destruction. Instead of falling to the far-right anti-establishmentarianism, these members have chosen to put their energy into a hopeful, progressive anti-establishment movement. They recognise that we can only challenge power by coming into direct conflict with it, and embrace this conflict with the establishment to win transformative changes for their daily lives. I am just as fearful and outraged by populism, misinformation, Trump, and the road to fascism, of which anti-establishment sentiment is exploited by, as I am about the child slavery, rampant inequality, genocide, and injustice which the establishment creates and upholds. Our collective pain and grief and anger has been co-opted by a far-right populism. People are screaming for dignity in their experiences of being left behind. And the right has channeled that energy into fueling the rhetoric of hate, division, and white supremacy. Instead of offering a genuine solution, they only perpetuate the inequalities and crises of our day, which are the breeding ground for people seeking an alternative in the first place. The question, which I hope I've made clear here, isn't whether anti-establishment movements will rise, it's who will control their direction. We don't get a choice in whether change is coming, but we do get a choice in what that looks like. The establishment and status quo has proven to us that it does not have the answers. So it's up to us to find the alternative. just as it was for Frederick Douglass, Mahatma Gandhi, Angela Davis, and members of Living Right. It's up to you whether our anti-establishment movement is runaway right-wing populism, or if it is the genuine and transformational positive force built on the principles of community, justice, peace, equality, and of course living in harmony with our planet. In this economy, how can you be anything other than anti-establishment? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Barry. I would now like to invite Hazel McArthur to continue the debate here.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of the Union and fellow debaters. Today I stand before you to argue against the notion that we should support the rise of anti-establishment sentiment. Instead of endorsing this very on-trend system, we should be focused on reforming our institutions so that they reflect the evolving needs and values of our modern society. Let me begin by addressing the powerful us versus them narrative. This worldview divides society into two different groups. Us, the everyday people who face everyday struggles, and then the distant, elite institutions, authorities, and politicians that are supposedly completely indifferent to the struggles that we have on a daily basis. This binary, very oversimplified perspective is quite attractive because it offers a clear enemy and a sense of belonging for those of us who feel marginalised. However, as history has shown us, such divisions rarely lead to any constructive change. Instead, they create deep fissures in our society and encourage us to view dialogue, compromise, and progress as acts of betrayal rather than steps for improvement. This isn't sustainable, and it's not really beneficial to anyone. Consider, for example, the recent, 2021, Capitol riots in the United States after the results of the election. This was an attack on democracy and on rule of law. What was actually achieved by this act of, quite frankly, national terrorism? Extensive vandalisation, which was costing millions of dollars. 5 people were killed, including a Capitol police officer who was beaten to death, caused by a conspiracy theory fueled by social media of voter fraud. And what was the outcome? Absolutely nothing. What progress or changes were made? None. Similarly, Brexit offers a less violent but equally interesting illusion of this phenomenon. In the Brexit vote, a significant portion of the British population were feeling alienated by a distant and unresponsive European Union and disconnected to the political elite, and they chose to reject the established order. Instead of trying to improve relations with the European Union, identifying the issues, the things that were not working, we decided to reject it. Also, what actually fueled Brexit? Well, according to studies by The Economist and other academic papers, up to 1/3 of the vote was caused by immigration. This was significantly high in areas that saw a significant increase in foreign-born population between 2001 and 2014. I can't believe that will do anybody any favours in an increasingly globalised and multicultural world. This brings me to one of my first points, social instability. Anti-establishment sentiment, when taken to its extreme, not only disrupts political processes, but also results in economic instability. When people no longer trust that their government, their economy, or even their friends and neighbours are working in their best interests, social cohesion begins to crumble. The fallout from events like the Capitol riots or Brexit is not just political rhetoric, it's a tangible disruption of the order that keeps society functioning. And to what end? To achieve what? Fear, hatred, more divide, instability, scaremongering? So let's delve a little bit more deeply into the root causes of the anti-establishment trend. At the heart of it lies a lot of discontentment with modern life. Today, people are bombarded, myself included, with the relentless pace of modern work, social media comparisons, pressures from economic challenges, unemployment, climate change, cost of living. It's all pretty doom and gloom. Many feel that the institutions are meant to be there to safeguard our well-being. Corporate establishments, political leaders, and even educational systems that have failed to address these real-world struggles. This deep disenchantment has led many to seek refuge in the anti-establishment narratives, which conveniently offers really simple answers to quite complex problems. The overwhelming sense of disillusionment does not just breed frustration, it lays the fertile ground for extremism as my colleague already stated. Far-right figures like Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage, who are funnily enough funded by the elite, have capitalised on these sentiments. They channel the anger and the fear that citizens have, turning what might have been cultural reform into cause of, quite frankly, destruction. By offering a vision that starkly divides society into the people versus the elite, it encourages a dangerous divide in society. Moving on to my next point, the psychological toll of modern life and its link with the anti-establishment rise. The pressures I've already mentioned of constant connectivity, the overwhelming flood of information, and the relentless pace of this unsustainable lifestyle that we all live now have left many people suffering from burnout and psychological overload. When people are mentally and emotionally exhausted, they become more vulnerable to extremist ideas and less capable of engaging constructively with established institutions. This is not a hypothetical situation. Our society is grappling with a mental health crisis on multiple fronts. It was stated by the NHS that 3.8 million people needed mental health resources in 2023 and 2024, which was a rise of 1.1 million cases of mental health illnesses from 2019. Over 1 million people that group are children. And who is it that is mostly impacted by social media and so heavily influenced by these anti-establishment narratives? Well, mostly young people and children. This brings me on to my next point of misinformation. In today's digital age, misinformation spreads at an unprecedented speed and reach. Social media platforms are a new way of communication. I mean, when was the last time any of you actually wrote a letter? Because I certainly don't know. They're also echo chambers where unvetted and often very dangerous and completely baseless arguments flourish. Young people, which are very disillusioned with traditional educational methods, are turning to these online platforms for education, for inspiration, and often encounter conspiracy theories that further fuel their anti-establishment sentiments. On average, I'm pretty sure all of us here have an Instagram account. Facebook's for the older generations, but I'm pretty sure we've all got Instagram. And TikTok is probably more your generation than mine, but the average user of TikTok is 24 years old, and 70% of the people that are on this app are between 18 and 35. Let's also remember that this is not a regulated app. Anyone can say anything in the name of free speech. The COVID-19 was a perfect example of that. We had people claiming that 5G was causing the virus, Bill Gates was out to get us all, and people drinking bleach in order to get rid of the virus, which was actually suggested by Donald Trump at the time. Such instances that are this severe highlight how the erosion of traditional knowledge sources leads to a dangerous reliance on platforms that often promote the very ideas that destabilise our communities and further divide us. I have also noticed as well in the past week that Kanye West, very famous rapper, ex-husband of Kim Kardashian, recently launched a clothing line which consisted of one t-shirt with a swastika on it. This man has 20.8 million followers just on Instagram alone, and it took an entire team for that t-shirt to be published, meaning that many people believe that in the name of free speech, anything can be done and anything can be said, and it's burning down the establishment is the right thing to do. This is dangerous rhetoric. So therefore, I come to my final point here. Shouldn't we reform instead of completely reject? The real problem isn't the existence of established institutions. They have provided stability and progress for many generations, but rather many of these institutions, as already stated by my colleague, haven't really kept up to date with the pace of modern life. Therefore, shouldn't we demand social, technological and economic changes to match with our modern era? Our society today is built on values that differ significantly from those of the past, and our institutions and politicians should reflect that. We're now a global, secular society, one that is interconnected in ways that completely, that our predecessors and former ancestors could not imagine. Yet many of our institutions remain outdated. So therefore, at the heart of this debate lies a universal human quest, the search for meaning and authenticity. In a world where modern technology often promotes superficiality through endless scrolling and curated images, many of which are completely modified or completely transformed through AI and other editing apps. Many people are left yearning for genuine connection and a return to authentic values. Anti-establishment movements tap into this longing, promising a break from the impersonal, exhausting structures that we currently have. But true authenticity cannot be achieved by tearing down the very foundations of our society. It must be cultivated by nurturing a system that evolves, adapts, and meets the needs of its people. Therefore, I'd like to finish by arguing that while the allure of anti-establishment sentiment is undeniable, its consequences are far too risky and far too dangerous. It breeds instability, fuels extremism, undermines the very democratic institute that safeguards our freedoms, and spreads misinformation that endangers our collective well-being. Therefore, I'd like to finish this speech with a quote. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Thank you.
Hazel, and for all of our speakers who have contributed to a very fine debate this evening. So now is the time when we open up the debate to the floor. So that means that anybody in attendance, any one of you can raise your hand to catch the eye of the chair, myself, stand and give a speech of up to 2 minutes, either critiquing one of the arguments that you've heard, asking for clarity, giving your own opinion, etc., etc. We do also offer a floor speech prize for the best floor speech this evening, which I think is a £15 voucher for Janettas. Wonderful. So high stakes, high reward. So without further ado, any speeches from the floor this evening? Yes, at the back, can you stand and state your name for a minute?
My name is George, and so three things that I'd like to say. The first is that there are many things that are deeply wrong with our society and should change. The climate crisis, inequality, even though there is a precedent for inequality in this time, it is still horrific.
George, can I ask you to speak up just a little bit, because on the stage you're quite quiet. Sorry.
And should be low. So inequality is too high if we have a climate crisis, and these are things that have to change, and the establishment has to change to carry that out. The second thing is that I'm really not sure that the product of a rising anti-establishment sentiment has the answers for this. In fact, I'm pretty much certain they don't, because the figures who have risen from this wave of anti-establishment sentiment are people like, obviously in the UK, Nigel Farage, they are nationalists, people who promoted Brexit. I think these anti-establishment moves have only made the problems that we face worse. And I think the third thing to say is that the establishment has taken a lot of slack this evening, but sometimes it does good things. There are lots of things that are very much part of the establishment that enormously benefit our lives. We get incredibly high quality journalism from the BBC. It is difficult to think of a more establishment media organisation than the BBC, and yet it is fantastic. The establishment subsidises, or in some cases entirely pays for our tuition fees so that we can attend this university. The establishment provides reasonably good conditioned roads and democracy as well. We are incredibly lucky to live in a liberal democracy where we can say what we want, where we can have these debates, and that is partly a result of all of us endeavouring to keep it going, but it's also very much to do with the establishment in the UK. And so, certainly, there are enormous changes that need to be made to face the challenges that are ahead of us. The figures that arise from this wave of anti-establishmentism do not have the answers. And thirdly, the establishment does sometimes, in fact, more than I think we give it credit for, get it right.
From the floor this evening. Yeah? Can you stand and state your name for a minute?
Alex. Well, most people started with a quote, so will I. Polish anti-communist dissident Adam Michnik said, "Those that raid the Bastille end up building a Bastille of their own." And I think that's fundamentally a big problem with politics. Any form of politics, especially anti-establishment politics, does want to eventually get into a position of power. Now, once most of anti-establishment forces get into power, they end up not doing really good things. And let's be clear about this, at least in Europe, I'm not going to talk about anywhere else, just the UK and Europe, the establishment, the so-called establishment, is the liberal democratic establishment, something that looks vaguely like two-party system, one certain left, one centre right, dominating. It is a system that has managed tackle the inherent contradictions that exist in tolerant, pluralistic societies, for the most part. Obviously, lots of things to be done. And I think that there is some hope here, because most of the times that Europe has swung to anti-establishment, look Greece in 2015 when they voted a very anti-establishment, progressive left-wing party. In 2019, the overall sentiment was anti-establishment in this economy. Someone had to pick up the pieces, and guess what? It was the establishment. And today, in France, with both the far left and the far right rising, squeezing the liberal democratic establishment, guess who is picking up the pieces? It has been the two of the most establishment politicians you can think of, Michel Barnier, and after him now François Bayrou. So maybe the answer is within the liberal democratic establishment that has been established with lots of hard work in Europe post 1945. Thank you very much.
Who would have thought that Alex is pro-establishment? Any other speeches from the floor? Parth?
So I think that the opposition arguments so far have been slightly lazy. I want to give the best opposition argument to proposition. I think there are some claims from proposition that I think are fair. But one ancillary comment before we start. There were always necessary and good forms of anti-establishment resistance, such as social movements in the past. These are not up for debate. There's about the rise that is taking place now. I think that's important to know. So, the argument from second cross is fair, that there needs to be better anti-establishment engagement. So we need to engage with those who are anti-establishment better. I think that's the best argument for control. But let's explain why this is not going to be the case. The sentiment itself is not effective in doing issues that they're raising, for example, like grassroots movements and stuff like that, because they're drowned out. And I challenge the proposition to explain how the positive aspects of the sentiment they explain will come out on top and will be able to do the things that they say they will. There are several reasons why this is not the case. The first is it's easier to buy into the claims that opposition are making as an average citizen. It's easier to blame, it's easier to complain about things, and we like doing it, it's a biological imperative to do so. Attacking someone or an institution that is vague and just up in the sky and we don't really know much about it is fun. It's an escapism and people like doing it and like being inflammatory. That's why often negative algorithms persist on social media rather than positive algorithms, and those get drowned out over time. But also, being negative requires very little action. You're just behind your phone. You don't need to offer up a solution, because it's a lot of mental and psychological load when you're on your phone, when you want to relax, rather than when you've been at work, to just say nothing or to offer no solution. But it's very, very easy to attack someone, which is why you wouldn't necessarily offer the solutions for how society should be reformed in the first place. But all of this means is that all of these negative sentiments compound over time and create worse forms of echo chambers which are more permanent, which means that the more negative it becomes, the more positive reactions you need, but those will continue to get drowned out because the negative reactions will always be faster, quicker, and larger. These are all the reasons why it's not going to be very, very positive, and that's why, on the whole, even though the proposition are correct, you should side with opposition.
Other speeches from the floor. Yes, just here. Please stand and state your name for the minutes.
And I'm sorry this is really as loud as I can go. I couldn't help but notice that both proposition and opposition seem to have the same political standpoint on a number of issues. So what I would really like to ask is, where does it differ? Why is it that one of you is pro-establishment and the other seems to have anti-establishment sentiments all ready to rise up? And to what extent are politicians, in both your opinions, on both sides, who pander to anti-establishment sentiments on either side of the political spectrum, considered part of the establishment themselves, whether or not they're working against it, whether or not they're doing it for their own interest, etc. And I couldn't help but also notice that the opposition doesn't really seem to bring up left-wing anti-establishment sentiment. To what extent would you agree with this or disagree with this? To what extent are they actually working for social justice? And to what extent are they doing it within the bounds of the establishment, within the bounds of preconceived systems and measures and checks and balances that have already been in place?
From the floor this evening. It's right at the back. Jim.
Yes, it got quite existential just there. We heard about the search for meaning in a global secular society. sort of off the back of your speech, I was wondering if we could have some more clarity about the kinds of values each side would like to platform. Perhaps equality is out there. What does that look like in your models? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Other speeches from the floor? Yeah, Jamie?
I'd quickly like to say that I'm a little bit disappointed by the fact that right and left-wing politics have been brought into this debate. Quite often I say that this kind of politics is too simple to capture big issues such as the establishment and anti-establishment. And in fact, throughout history, anti-establishment sentiment has swung greatly in between left-wing and right-wing politics. And so I'd ask both the opposition and the proposition, however the proposition was championing this the most, I'd ask you to try and keep as much as possible this polarized politics out of the discussion and try to build an argument from more of a grassroots level, rather than using, for example, the Trump administration to make an argument. I'm going to quickly then talk about the proposition's entire argument that relies on, as Barry so elegantly put it, in this economy. You say that people are disillusioned, they're empowered by the anti-establishment sentiment. But to what extent is this disillusion, this empowerment, just a result of hope, fear, illusion and disillusion? As I was saying, these polarized ideas. Very conceded that these polarized views, as a result of these sentiments, lead to extremism. Extremism leads to mass depression, civil war, genocide sometimes even, and a plethora of other disastrous results. I'd like to hear the proposition argue why this anti-establishment sentiment which you are championing so much is not going to lead us into a state of complete and utter destruction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Jamie. Any other speeches from the floor this evening? Yes, just here, please stand and state your name for minutes.
Sure, I'm Isaac. I should probably start by saying I studied post-colonialism. I think it's interesting, the person back here said that their establishment has given them roads and good things. And the person right here said that their establishment has balanced right-wing and left-wing politics. And yet, for most of the people in the world, it doesn't matter whether we get a Macron or a Le Pen. You're still taking lithium and cobalt and whatever you want from our countries. So I think there's an aspect of privilege in the conversation of supporting an establishment or not supporting an establishment. And the other piece I would say, to the lady's point over here, in terms of the political positions, I think that's true that both sides up here seem to have similar positions on some of the rise in right-wing sentiment. But I would just say, taking the case of Trump and January 6th, certainly January 6th was insurrectionary and illegal, but for many of you, Trump seems out of the ordinary. But Trump, for many of us, is resuming an establishment that we worked to upset for years, and which for only about 2 decades did we sort of get movement on that point. And so it's worth thinking about what it means to actually have an establishment and what we mean when we say establishment. And I think that accounts for some of the difficulty in reckoning with both sides having some of the same political positions.
Okay, thank you very much to Isaac. Any other speeches from the floor? Yeah, Owen?
To what extent are some of the negative outcomes of anti-establishment sentiment kind of self-defeating? I'd be very surprised if, once Trump has done all of these crazy policies, that does not harm the perception of these kind of types of leaders who use and weaponize this anti-establishment sentiment to do harm to others, and perhaps will push that swing of this anti-establishment sentiment to groups and organizations that are more likely to do good with that kind of weight that they're riding.
Okay, thank you to Owen. We have time for a couple more speeches from the floor. No? So some people are elbowing and nodding at other people, so just waiting to see how effective they are. Lawrence is being peer pressured like nobody's business. Any other speeches from the floor? Okay, fine. In which case, thank you very much for your contributions. We will announce the winner of the Best Floor Speech Prize at the end of the debate this evening. So now it's time to return to the tables. We go in reverse order, so we will be starting with the opposition. Have you decided who's speaking first and how you're splitting your time this evening? Yeah. 5 and 5, and if we're going in reverse order, that would mean Hazel is speaking first. Is that right?
Preferably not, but...
Preferably not, okay. In which case, yeah, we'll invite Dr. Foster back.
Start this. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for those superb comments and questions. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be giving us another speech or addressing some of these points. What I will attempt to do is combine the two and make it up on the hoof. I would like to thank the opposition, and I want to apologise if you feel that I was denigrating anti-establishment persons with the analogy of the Lawrence Fox wannabe and the Darlington Wetherspoons or failed hippies in London. I was not referring specifically to anyone, but caricaturing anti-establishment. After all, that's what I do. I'm an academic. So I think that a lot of the speeches that have been given by the opposition and by people on the floor have raised the point that there is a great deal of commonality between both positions here today. Common understanding, well, common belief, because we're not clairvoyants, a common belief that the system is badly broken and is failing to provide for people, whether it is people on council estates in Sunderland, whether it's people whose resources are being plundered, regardless of who is in the Elysee Palace. The system isn't working. The division between us appears to be that we may be a little more nihilistic. This is the first time I've actually been called lazy before in an argument. I quite like that. I'm going to admit it. This is the second time in a week that I've been accused of being deathly pessimistic. We agree that it isn't functioning. We think that the system can be reformed. That the best hope for the I know it sounds grandiose, the best hope for the planetary system at the moment is to try and fix the institutions, the systems, the processes that were set up in the aftermath of both world wars to try and prevent the circumstances by which there would be another social breakdown, a new Bretton Woods system for the world, to rise the tide for all boats, not just people in the West, not just people in certain areas of the world, but for everyone. Because the system cannot improve if only some benefit and others continue to fail and to lose out. We feel that it can be reformed. We are extremely concerned about propositions to so radically challenge the system that we could end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because in an ideal world, and as the opposition and people here have said, there have been so many occasions when anti-establishment was correct, were politically, morally, ethically correct in challenging corrupt and broken systems. My concern is that while there are still plenty of these brave people challenging a broken system, their voices are drowned out. I can't remember who mentioned the algorithm of doom, which would be a great name for a band. That all of the good sentiments in the world are not going to account for much if they cannot reach the same number of people who are raised on a diet of anxiety, fear, and hate. The establishment is badly broken, but fixing it is the only possible solution that we have. We are living in an age of increasing authoritarianism, but authoritarianism not coming from Plato's philosopher kings, from men and women who were driven by a sense of morality, social justice, and duty to their fellow human being. We're being run by the equivalents of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, or Carter Pewterschnitt from Family Guy. People who have zero interest in fixing the system because they are not going to suffer as the world burns, they are not going to suffer as the bombs drop, and they will not even laugh when you get foreclosed upon and are sleeping on the street. The only option for fixing this realistically is reforming the institutions that we have, reforming, not throwing away the establishment. Thank you.
Finish or conclude the debate for side opposition. Here.
I would just also like to add, as well as my colleague, that I've certainly never been called lazy. I've been called a lot of names, so I've never been called lazy before in an argument, so I will take that one proudly. I would like to firstly reference the quote that was made by the first speaker at the very end of his speech. Try again, fail better. And I'm not sure if I'm understanding correctly or not, but I think we should learn from our mistakes rather than fail again. Is that not the whole point of making mistakes? We take what we've done, we learn from them, and we improve. We've seen improvements in our establishment in the past few years, and alongside getting some good roads, although I would disagree that Fife could do with some more work, we have had adaptations to institutions at government level in the UK to keep up with the changes in our demands. For example, there was the Department of Energy and Climate back in July 2003. It was then changed over to the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in 2016. And that was again completely reformed in 2023 to 3 different departments. One of Energy Security and Net Zero, another of Innovation and Technology, and another one of Business and Trade. So I do agree with the gentleman who made the point that there are some positive things to come out of the establishment. We're very lucky here in Scotland to benefit from free higher education, free prescriptions, and some more or less decent roads. But there are interests by government showing that they are willing to reform. I'd also like to mention the point that was made as well about that there is approximately 113 million people that were displaced in 2023, and this was all done by design, and it was caused by our greed. Now, I'd like to ask the speaker to answer my question regarding this statistic, because is this being fueled by the establishment in terms of politics and big institutions, or is this being driven by our greed? Is this being driven by us wanting the new iPhone every single time one's out? Is this wanting the biggest Christmas that you could possibly have? Is this caused by our greed as a society of more materialism, fueled by social media, fueled by stresses and anxiety to be up to date and to keep up with the Joneses? Or is this genuinely an issue that is being caused by the establishment? I think it's more due to our attitudes as a society of wanting 14 different types of bread when we go to Waitrose rather than 2 that is fueling this inequality on a global level. And finally, I would like to reiterate what I mentioned in terms of personal change and the issue potentially being with society, not with the establishment itself. I mean, we should modernise our institutions so they're up to our standards and they reflect what we need, but isn't it also important that we take a look at ourselves and we say, okay, this is the current situation. We have climate change, we have a cost of living crisis, we have X, Y, Z. There's less and less people going to university because they quite frankly do not see the point anymore. That has been the case in the US and in England in the past 2 years, which is quite sad. Instead of thinking, what are the things that I can do to improve my quality of life? What can I do in order to make a change? You know, just go and blame someone else and just cause a riot and just start making rants on TikTok? It doesn't really seem to be a proper solution, especially not in the long term. Our institutions, as the gentleman said at the back, have long served us for many generations, and they have been able to provide solutions for most of the world's problems. I don't think it's time to completely give up on them altogether. I think it's time to demand more effectively what we need, integrate our beliefs and also engage at local level and at national level with government so that they reflect what we need, and demand the changes that we require, both on national levels and at international levels. We have seen reforms thanks to Black Lives Matter protests, to engaging with communities at both local and national levels, talking to MPs, forming unions. There are other ways of doing this than completely dismantling the entire establishment and starting from scratch with leaders such as Elon Musk, Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Hazel and to our opposition this evening. Now it's time to return to the proposition. We decided how to divide on the time for speaking first.
We're going to split it.
Split it equally, and we're inviting Dr. Tsokov back first. Wonderful. Thank you.
Address everything to the best of my ability. Okay, what should we start with first? So first, there were a few questions about let's say, how likely is anti-establishment politics to turn out to be positive? How likely is it to result in genocide? So I mean, as a thing, and what I said earlier, hopefully I tried to convey in my speech, that we don't know. I mean, history is contingent. We don't know what our actions are going to lead to. But surely in our current situation, and kind of addressing your comment that we are referring to the American context too much, currently the current anti-establishment wave that is across Europe and which already won in the US is far from living by particular democratic pillars or values. I think we will all agree, whether to support this type of politics or not, that the separation of powers, checks and balances are under threat, and that pluralism, which is the pillars of liberalism, are under threat. So, of course, that's an ideological argument. But, well, what is it going to lead to genocide? We don't know. But it's our responsibility to not let it lead to genocide. Would you not agree with that? So, I think, again, I feel there is, some of you mentioned that there are too many parallels between our arguments. I feel that's not really the case. Maybe it's my fault. I didn't perhaps convey what I mean well, but the talks from both of you were great, but for me, they are the general response of the, let's say, liberal or a bit more radical left today. So on the one hand, we have, I'm sorry personally, but we have the argument that sure, the new liberal establishment is decaying and and so on, but the anti-establishment politics that we have now do not lead to anything much better. But I think the mistake here of having a hope, this is what some leftists did in 2016, with the hope that if Trump wins, perhaps the new liberal establishment will open up a possibility for more radical or more, let's say, socialist changes. I'm not saying that this is what we're arguing, but certain arguments have been made, and I think this is the wrong approach. And I think just the way we approach this far-right and radical conservative politics today by making particular metaphors or undermining how serious the situation is not the right approach. And I think it's time to take them seriously, both academically and as a phenomenon. Try to understand how it works, because how many people voted for Brexit or for Trump? This is a part of the population which we cannot ignore. So how does it work? And my point here is that instead of resorting to some sort of borderline undemocratic politics to defend democracy, whether that could be censorship and so on, we should rather try to reorganize our own strategy. And by we, I mean those of us who do not necessarily agree with such type of politics. So I hope this point is conveyed a bit better. Populism, I don't think what I try to propose today is not a dirty word. It's something which even those of us who do not agree with our current situation today need to engage, take seriously, study, and reorganize our own strategies of how perhaps we can engage in such discursive practices as well. Okay, so to the fail better argument, again, I mean, that's me. I was making more of a theoretical points. My point was that democracy will never be perfect. Sure, we can strive for equality, we can try our best, but it can never capture the desire of every single citizen finding this. So the fail better part is to try to come as close to those ideals as we can, because I think they are essentially a failure.
10 seconds.
All right, I don't have much more time, but hopefully I address some of the points. Happy to have a chat with you once this is finished.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tsokov. Now I would like to welcome back Barry to conclude the debate as a whole. Yeah.
Now forgive me because my notes are all over the place. Firstly, thanks to those who spoke from the floor. I wanted to take the point of what happens when an anti-establishment movement comes into power. Where do we go then? Well, I would argue we continue to be anti-establishment, especially when necessary, and continue to challenge it. The workers' rights and trade union movement in the UK was anti-establishment. It was born by Labour, and when they won power, they created the NHS and built millions of affordable homes. Although in doing so, they became the establishment. And now many would argue that they're no longer serving people. The opposition called anti-establishment sentiment on trend. And I would say, well, of course it is. It's dynamic. It is an energy which must be constant, I think, within any healthy democracy, to do exactly as I said in my first argument, to come into conflict with a system, to challenge it, and to hopefully improve it. And that's why it's pertinent to the debate tonight, because we're discussing the rise of anti-establishment sentiment. There are times where I would agree the rise of anti-establishment sentiment might not be helpful, particularly if the establishment is working for us. Although my argument rests on the notion that this isn't the case. The establishment is not working for us, and it has to be challenged. You're right to bring up left and right, so I want to be clear about my position on that. Ignoring left and right, I reject an anti-establishment sentiment that is born from the principles of hate and division, and I support an anti-establishment sentiment that is born in the principles of justice and equality and peace. And the point about reform, not rejection. At no point did either of us say that we completely reject. I do not completely reject democracy, but I do believe that we need to get money out of politics and use legislation to ban lobbying. Frederick Douglass didn't completely reject every aspect of his society. He rejected a particular aspect of it, and he was anti-establishment by doing so. Another point that I want to raise was about social media. You said 3 million people need mental health support. I would argue that they need it because they're a victim of the establishment for the very reasons I've outlined tonight. But you mentioned the echo chambers of social media and the dangers that that poses. I should remind you that the CEOs of those companies, who are in charge of the algorithms that churn out the hate that you comment on, who are they? They're the billionaires. One of them right now is the right-hand man of the President of the United States. They are the most politically powerful and wealthy oligarchs in the entire world. They are the establishment. I think of the disagreements tonight, I will attempt to find some things that we can agree on. We know that we will not have a livable planet unless we change. We are rapidly accelerating towards complete catastrophe, and in fact, it's already a reality for many of our neighbours, brothers and sisters in the global south, which is a point that those of us in the global north don't seem to consider. We know that if we don't redistribute wealth, people are going to increasingly look to alternatives to justify their grievances at watching a global elite fly by private jet. And if we know from history that if we don't do something now and propose a radical and progressive anti-establishment, not born from the left, but born from the principles of justice and equality, that the horrors that the establishment will produce under people like Trump or Modi or whoever it may be could potentially be unimaginably catastrophic. That is why I reaffirm that I am proudly anti-establishment, one of equality and wanting a better world for our society. And I hope that you agree.
Okay, thank you very much to Barry and to all of our speakers this evening. So now it is time to call the House to vote. So those who agree with the proposition, i.e. you support the rise in anti-establishment sentiment, please raise your hands now. Keep them nice and high first. Okay, I'm assuming you two as well. And then all those who are against the motion, i.e. you do not support the rise of anti-establishment sentiment, including yourself. Okay, thank you very much. And any abstentions?
No
Wonderful. Maybe two. Wonderful. Okay, so before we announce who has won the debate this evening, it's time for some announcements from board. So if we can begin with Alex, Chair Ways and Means.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex. I'm in charge of the public debates. We do these every week, and I hope you enjoyed this one because next week is going to be another really exciting one on the Commonwealth. This House believes that the Commonwealth is a force for good, and we're going to have a couple of great speakers coming along, including the director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies coming along. So that's going to be very fun. And we're going to go back to the UDS's home at LPH, so not here. Thank God. So all that's left for me is to thank our wonderful speakers for tonight. Thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure having you.
And then I think we'll go to Abby for competitive announcements.
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm not the head of competitive debate, so I'm quite nervous because Park will probably call me lazy, but that's okay. So we do novice debate training every 2 p.m. top floor of the union. It's completely beginner friendly. Come along, you can speak, judge, observe. It's completely up to you. What? On a Wednesday? Oh, sorry. Okay, Wednesday, top floor of the union, 2 p.m. That was being lazy. We send people to both internal and external competitions. We've got an internal one coming up next weekend, which should be quite fun. So if you're interested in that, come and speak to anybody. You can sign up for that, or any external ones too. And we'd love to see you there.
To our steward slash we're in a minute taking receiving clerk.
Let me tell you, my fingers have never worked faster than my mouth. If you thought that was great, but you think you might need a bit of a drink after that, let's go back to Barry's old home and go to the top floor of the union, the Beacon Bar, for a drink afterwards. Hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you to Ara, who stepped in last minute to be clerk this evening, and also to Beatty, who I believe had a hand in organising this week's debate. Okay, wonderful. So without further ado, the winner of the floor speech prize this evening goes to Isaac. So if you pop down to see Alex in a moment, he'll be able to give you your prize. For the announcement of who has won the debate this evening. So the ayes to the right are 11 and the nays to the left 27 with 1 abstention. So the the opposition have it. Congratulations. Next week is This House believes that the Commonwealth is a force for good, so please do join us again, and if you would like to sign up to the mailing list, please do so. You can come and speak to me or to Jamie about that, and follow us on Insta if you're not already, and we'll see you at the union. Thank you very much, everybody.